Hello, I'm Ollie, and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, 10 things Stephen King has taught me about America, which I think are probably true. So I've been reading Stephen King for about 35 years, so since I was 13 or 14. And during that time, I've read not all of his books, but most of his books. I've read more than 50 of his books. And I've read them consistently throughout my life. So my teens, my 20s, my 30s, my 40s. I've always read Stephen King. And when I started reading him, so when I was a teenager in the 80s, he gave me a sense of America that I probably wasn't getting from anywhere else. So King writes very much about small town America. And the kind of stuff I was seeing about America in movies and in TV shows was not really focused on, kind of normal life. And while King is a horror writer, and clearly his books are horror books, the characters in his books typically are just normal people. And that, I think, is something I wasn't really seeing much of outside of the Stephen King that I was reading. A lot of the books I was reading were sci-fi and things like that. So I just wasn't getting that exposure to normal, everyday American life through other means that I got from Stephen King. And what that has meant is, I think my perception of America is very much driven by my exposure to Stephen King in my teens and 20s. So I remember back then, no internet. I did know some American people, and I went to the States when I was kind of 19, but only for a few weeks. So I think a lot of the sense I have of what America is like comes from the work of Stephen King. And I think he's interesting because, as I say, he tends to write about, normal people in small town America. And when you think of, movies and things like that, they're much more often about either, extraordinary people, or they're about, they're not about small town America, they're about the cities. And when so Spielberg is a director who certainly early on in his career did focus on that kind of, small town middle America type of thing, with films like E.T. and Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. All of those feature that, that kind of everyday character. But as his career progressed, he ended up doing all sorts of different things, both in terms of, historical stuff, much more fantastic stuff. Whereas King had that, I think that small town vibe has always been absolutely central to his work and continues to be. I think, I've just picked up this yesterday, Billy Summers, which has just come out in paperback, which I think a lot of people didn't like very much, but I like the concept. But this sounds, really small towny. Again, it's about a veteran, but a veteran who I think lives in, a kind of small town. So yeah, small town America, middle America, normal America is central to Stephen King. And I've made a list of 10 things that are things I believe to be true about America that I think I've picked up from Stephen King's books. So I'm going to go through those 10 things now. Please don't be offended if you're an American and you think what I'm saying is terrible. But do let me know in the comments if you think I'm wrong. But yeah, I've got 10 things, and then I've got a further 3 things which I think probably aren't true, but which are also typical of Stephen King's work. So without further ado, let me get on with it. So number 1, organised religion shouldn't be trusted. So I think that's a consistent theme in King's books, is that people who are too into religion tend to be a bit crazy, and I think that is, from the perception I have, is that is broadly true of religion in America, that there are lots of extremists who practice their extremeness under the guise of religion. Okay, next one. Everyone uses slurs. And it may be that this is less true in King's more recent books, but I'm not sure it is. I think it's true in all his books. So many of the characters, and typically not sympathetic characters, but many of the characters will use slurs, either racial slurs, or kind of homophobic slurs, or sexist slurs. You know, it's really, really common in his books, far more common than it has been in my day-to-day life. So that is, you know, another perception of America that I've picked up from King, is that, you know, the use of slurs is fairly common, and I think that's probably broadly true. Again, you know, correct me if I'm wrong. Next one is junk food is a treat. I think that's probably true in the UK as well, but it's definitely true in Stephen King's book. So, you know, junk food is considered to be a wonderful treat. And, you know, King has compared his books to a hamburger. So, you know, junk food, I think, is really important to him. But you often get bits in his books where characters, you know, kind of really enjoy snacks and, you know, Hershey bars and, you know, what they called hostess cakes, whatever they call that kind of thing, Coke. So yeah, junk food is definitely central to King's books, and it seems to me central to American life as well. Next one, not everyone has guns. So this is an interesting one. So the external perception of America, more so now than ever, I think, is that, you know, gun ownership is you know, endemic. Everyone has guns. But in King's books, guns really don't play a very big part at all. A much smaller part than you would expect, given the kind of books he is writing. You know, there are guns in some of his books, but they're really not that common. And I think it's important for us outside the US to remember that whilst a lot of people in America do have guns, a lot of people in America also don't have guns. And I think that's something that comes across in King's work. Okay, next one, high school sucks. So high school in King's books, you know, starting with his first book, Carrie, seems to be a pretty horrible place. I'm sure it has improved over the years, as I think, you know, the school system over here has improved over the years in terms of how kids feel when they're at school. But yeah, high schools seem to be pretty awful, very tribal, quite brutal places in Stephen King's books for teachers as well as pupils. Okay, next one, nobody uses public transport. So I was thinking back, and I think so there's clearly in one of the Dark Tower books, and I forget which one it is, there's a long bit where they go on a train, but it's like a fantasy train that is intelligent in fantasy world. And there's some subway scenes in the Dark Tower series as well. But broadly speaking, people just don't use public transport in Stephen King books. There might be some references to Greyhound buses and things like that, but generally speaking, public transport, you know, is not mentioned. Cars are everything. I mean, he even wrote a book about a monster car. And I think that, you know, that is definitely, seems to me to be something that is true of America, that public transport is much less, you know, the public transport infrastructure is much less built up than it is in other countries. Next one, middle-aged straight white men have the power. So that definitely, I think, is true in America, and it's definitely true in King's books as well. So, you know, the powerful characters in King's books are almost always straight, white, middle-aged men. You know, you think of the mayor character in Under the Dome, for example. You know, he seems like a really typical Stephen King character. And yeah, they hold the power, they abuse that power in the same way that, you know, religious characters often do in Stephen King books. You know, there seems to be this consistent theme that people who have power abuse it to oppress their fellow people, particularly kind of working class people. Right, next one. Kind of related to the one above, but politicians are self-serving. So you do not get noble politicians in Stephen King books. You know, politicians are out for themselves, out to make money for themselves, out to get power and to use that power for their own ends. And that seems, again, to me to be something that is true of politicians, broadly speaking, in the US and other places too, let's be honest. But, you know, the presence of, you know, huge lobbying firms and things like that in the US who offer incentives to politicians, you know, feels like it really, you know, rings true with King's view of politicians. Okay, next one. The world outside America doesn't matter to America. So I think this is pretty true of America, particularly kind of post 50 or 50 from the 50s onwards. Apart from when America is invading foreign countries with regimes it doesn't approve of, broadly speaking, everyday Americans do not care about the rest of the world, and that's certainly true of King's books. King's books are all set in the States. I tried to think of a Stephen King book that wasn't set in the States, apart from ones that are set in complete fantasy world, and I couldn't think of one. So he is incredibly US centric, and that's fine. He's an American writer. He's entitled to write about whatever he likes to. But like I said in that comparison with Spielberg, where Spielberg has ended up really broadening his repertoire and making movies about all sorts of different things, King has remained very, very US focused. And then the final one of my top 10, rock and roll would never die. So rock and roll, continues to be really important in King's books. He frequently has references, like at the start of chapters, little bits of snippets of lyrics and things like that. And popular culture, not just music, but popular culture generally, is incredibly important in Stephen King's books. He talks about it a lot. He has characters, reminiscing about shows I used to watch on TV and, talking about movies and things like that a lot. And a lot of what I know about American popular culture, particularly from kind of the 50s and 60s, I've learned from Stephen King's books rather than having been exposed to the programmes myself. But yeah, rock and roll, I think, is the most important thing to King. And I believe I'm right in saying he actually owns a radio station in the town he lives in. So yeah, rock and roll seems really, really important to King. And clearly, the music business is hugely important in the States generally. Rock and roll maybe not as important as it was, but rock and roll is one of those types of music that keeps on coming back and keeps on having an influence, particularly in American music. So those are my 10 things that I think are true. Here are the 3 things that are typical in Stephen King books that I think probably aren't true. So the first one is people with psychic abilities are usually good people. So in King's books, if a character's psychic, they're probably good. In the real world, clearly there aren't actually people with psychic abilities. I think there are people who pretend to have psychic abilities, and they're normally con artists. Next one, about 20% of the male population in Stephen King books are writers. I don't believe that is true in America, but it's certainly in King's books, so many people are writers. And then the final one is that in the long run, things work out, but in the short term, they're pretty terrible. So that is true, both if you think of his novels. So in his novels, characters go through all sorts of horrible things, but in the end, everything works out okay. But if you think about the novels compared to the short stories, so King's short stories often end terribly for the characters with, kind of twist endings and disaster. Whereas, as I say, the novels, terrible stuff might happen through the course of the novel, but by the end of it, things are okay. So yes, let me know what you think of my 10 things which I believe to be true, and my 3 things I don't. Let me know if you agree that they are true of Stephen King's books, even if they're not true in real life. And let me know, particularly if you're in America, what you think about my random generalisations about your country. Okay, time for me to pluck a random book from the shelves. So today I have this rather nice vintage Pan Book of Horror Stories, the 8th Pan Book of Horror Stories, edited by Herbert Van Thal. So this series of books was like really popular in the UK, and I remember as a kid, this one clearly came out before I was born, so this came out in 1967. But I remember as a kid, these being frequently on the shelves in bookstores and things like that. So yeah, a long running and very, very popular series of short story anthologies by a variety of different authors. This one I haven't read this book yet, and I've just noticed that it's got The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury in it, which I've always wanted to read. I hadn't realised it was in here, so I will have to crack this open and read that at some point. Okay, that's my Sunday ramble for today. So do let me know what you thought of it. And as always, I hope you're safe and well. I hope you read really good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.